They weren't in the paintings. They weren't at the signing tables. Most didn't wear uniforms or carry muskets. But without them, there would have been no revolution, at least not one that survived. While the soldiers were off fighting redcoats in muddy fields and freezing forests, it was the women who kept the colonies alive. And they did it quietly, relentlessly, and without asking for recognition. In towns like Concord and Savannah, and on farms stretching across the 13 colonies, women picked up the pieces left behind by war. They didn't choose this burden. It was placed on them when their husbands, fathers, and sons marched off under flags stitched together by hand. And what they did with that burden was nothing short of extraordinary. Take Deborah Franklin, for instance, wife of Benjamin Franklin. While her husband was off in Europe playing diplomat, Deborah stayed in Philadelphia, running the family business and defending their home during violent uprisings. She once wrote to Ben, telling him how local mobs had come to their door, how she stood her ground to protect their property. She wasn't a revolutionary by title, but she was one by action. Multiply her story by thousands, and you start to see the real scale of sacrifice. Then there were the women who took over farms and shops, managed estates, and kept entire communities running. A widow named Eliza Wilkinson, living in South Carolina, wrote about British soldiers ransacking her family's home, taking everything they could carry. She didn't fight them off with a weapon, but with dignity. She rebuilt, she endured. That's the kind of strength that rarely gets mentioned in the history books. And while war marched through towns and cities, bringing fear and fire with it, women found ways to maintain order in disorder. They organized food drives when local militias were starving. They cared for wounded soldiers when hospitals were overflowing. Some even followed their husbands into camps, cooking meals, washing clothes, and nursing the sick and dying, all while living in tents or makeshift shelters. They weren't called soldiers, but they suffered the same exposure to disease, hunger, and death. History remembers them as camp followers, but that phrase barely hints at the hardship they endured or the roles they played. Even in their silence, their loyalty was political. When women made their own clothing rather than buy British textiles, it was a statement. When they boycotted imported tea or gathered supplies for troops, they were choosing sides in a war that hadn't yet guaranteed them anything. No vote, no legal status, no voice, and yet they fought with every stitch, every barrel of food, every sleepless night spent protecting what little they had. The revolution was more than musket smoke and fiery speeches. It was also gardens tilled alone, children raised under cannon fire, and homes defended with little more than stubborn hope. These women didn't ask to become the backbone of the revolution. They became it anyway. And in doing so, they didn't just keep the war going. They kept the idea of a new nation alive. If you think espionage in the American Revolution was only the work of shadowy men in cloaks passing secret messages under cover of darkness, think again. Some of the most vital intelligence work during the war came from women, ordinary women, who turned their kitchens, drawing rooms, and sewing baskets into centers of strategy. They weren't just sitting quietly by the fire. They were listening, watching, and acting. And the success of the Patriot cause depended on it more than most people realize. Take Anna Smith Strong of Setauket, Long Island. She wasn't a soldier, and she didn't carry weapons, but she was part of the Culper spy ring, one of the most effective espionage networks in the entire Revolutionary War. Anna used her clothesline as a code. Literally, she hung black petticoats and white handkerchiefs in specific patterns to send signals to Patriot agents. A certain number meant a meeting. A different configuration meant a drop had been made. Her neighbors thought she was just doing laundry. Meanwhile, she was helping coordinate the flow of critical intelligence that passed directly to George Washington himself. And she wasn't alone. Another woman, Agent 355, remains a mystery to this day. Historians don't even know her real name. But what we do know is that she was embedded deep within British circles in New York City, using her position, possibly as a socialite or even a servant, to overhear conversations from British officers and loyalist elites. She passed that information back to the Patriots, often at great personal risk. She may have helped uncover the treason of Benedict Arnold, or even exposed Major John Andre, the British spymaster who was captured and hanged. Her name was never recorded, possibly to protect her identity, and sadly, she may have died in a British prison ship. Nameless but not forgotten, women like Lydia Darragh, a Philadelphia Quaker, played the long game. She let British officers use her home for meetings, listening through the walls while pretending to go about her daily chores. When she overheard plans for a surprise British attack on Washington's forces, she slipped out under the pretense of buying flour and delivered the warning just in time. Her bravery likely saved hundreds of lives, and sometimes the weapons weren't intelligence but deception. Women would hide messages inside hollowed-out shoes, sewn into dresses, even baked into loaves of bread. One clever courier, Emily Geiger, memorized a letter when she was caught by Loyalist forces, then calmly ate the document piece by piece to keep it from falling into enemy hands. After they released her, she simply wrote on and recited it from memory. There was no formal training, no medals, no guarantees. These women used whatever resources were available: clothing lines, dinner tables, baskets of apples. The very things that made them seem harmless became tools of subversion. In a world where being underestimated could be a survival strategy, women used their invisibility as a kind of power. They weren't generals or politicians, but they changed the outcome of battles all the same, one whispered secret, one hidden message at a time. It's easy to picture the American Revolution as a man's war, O's of soldiers in tattered uniforms marching through mud with muskets over their shoulders. But that picture is missing something, because woven into those ranks, hidden beneath the dirt and gunpowder, were women. Not just following behind or tending the wounded, but disguised, armed, and ready to fight. Some of them marched shoulder to shoulder with men, keeping their secret buried deeper than the bullets they carried. One of the most remarkable was Deborah Sampson, a Massachusetts woman who spent over a year fighting under the name Robert Shurtliff. She bound her chest, wore men's clothing, and passed as a male soldier in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. Deborah wasn't just hiding in the back. She fought in actual battles, including skirmishes in New York, and was even wounded. When she took a musket ball to the thigh, she didn't dare go to a military surgeon, terrified her secret would be discovered. So she did something most soldiers wouldn't even consider. She dug the ball out herself with a knife and sewed the wound shut. That kind of determination, grit, and resolve would have earned a man a promotion. Deborah got silence, and she wasn't alone. There were others whose names we may never know, because passing as a man wasn't just dangerous, it was punishable. If discovered, women could be expelled from the army, humiliated, even imprisoned. But still, some chose to risk everything. Why? Some believed in the cause, others followed loved ones, and a few simply refused to be left behind. They weren't seeking fame. They were chasing freedom on their own terms, even if it meant lying to the very army they were helping. Not every woman in the revolution had to disguise herself to be near the front lines. Many were there openly, serving in a different way. The so-called camp followers weren't just tagging along. They cooked meals, washed clothes, patched uniforms, and nursed the sick. Some helped reload cannons during battle, like Mary Ludwig Hayes, better known as Molly Pitcher, who took her husband's place at the cannon during the Battle of Monmouth when he collapsed from heat exhaustion. Imagine standing in a field full of smoke, cannons roaring, men screaming, and stepping into that chaos without hesitation. That's what she did. But while their labor was essential, it was often dismissed. Camp followers became a term used with condescension, even suspicion. Yet without them, armies would have collapsed from disease, hunger, and logistical failure. Women like Margaret Corbin, who also took up arms when her husband was killed, were left with lifelong injuries and no official military rank, no medals, no parades. These women didn't fight for recognition. They fought because the war came to them, into their homes, their families, their futures, and they refused to sit quietly on the sidelines. They took on the dirt, the cold, the blood, and the fear just like the men. They walked into danger wrapped in a lie or defined by labor, and they did it because liberty, for them, wasn't just an idea. It was survival, and sometimes it meant marching straight into hell to prove they belonged in the story. Before a single shot was fired at Lexington, before the Declaration of Independence was even an idea, women across the colonies had already started fighting back, not with rifles, but with spinning wheels and looms. It might not sound like warfare, but in the Revolution, economics was a battlefield, and women were on the front lines of it. The British taxed goods the colonists depended on: tea, fabric, sugar, paper, and hoped to choke out resistance by squeezing the daily lives of ordinary people. But women saw through it, and instead of waiting for permission to act, they took matters into their own hands. Nowhere was this more visible than in the boycotts. When Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, slapping duties on imported items like glass, lead, and most notably, tea, women became essential to the protest, because in most households, women made the decisions about what to buy, what to cook, and how to clothe their families. Every purchase, or refusal to purchase, was a political act. Suddenly, choosing not to serve tea became more than personal taste. It became a symbol of resistance. In places like Boston and Philadelphia, women organized themselves into what became known as the Daughters of Liberty. They weren't just echoing the Sons of Liberty. They were building a resistance economy of their own. They held public spinning bees, where they gathered to spin homes, spun cloth, and show they didn't need British textiles. It wasn't just practical, it was a statement. These women weren't only rejecting British goods, they were rejecting British control. Homespun dresses became badges of honor, not signs of poverty. Wearing one said, "We're not relying on you anymore." And these weren't small, isolated acts. Women created entire networks to support the boycotts. They passed along homemade recipes for herbal teas to replace British imports. They organized local markets to trade goods made within the colonies. They hosted meetings to encourage more women to participate, and they used their social influence to pressure those who didn't. This wasn't just patriotism, it was strategy. Women used their domestic roles, the very roles society limited them to, and turned them into instruments of economic warfare. Some women, like Mercy Otis Warren, even took their resistance a step further. While others spun cloth, she spun words, writing political satire and pamphlets that criticized British rule and stirred colonial anger. Her living room in Massachusetts became a hub of revolutionary thought, and her pen became as sharp as any sword. The power in all of this was subtle but undeniable. The British saw themselves as masters of trade, but they didn't account for the quiet rebellion unfolding inside homes and workshops. They didn't see how refusing a cup of tea could echo louder than a protest march. And that's what made these women dangerous in the eyes of the empire. They weren't standing in the street yelling at soldiers. They were changing the entire supply chain. They did it without fanfare. No medals, no speeches. Just deliberate choices made over and over again. They turned everyday actions into political defiance, and in doing so, they proved that revolutions don't start with muskets. They start with people deciding they've had enough. And they did it not just by saying no to Britain, but by saying yes to something entirely new, American independence, built with their own hands. When we talk about the voices that stirred revolution, we tend to hear the same names: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin. But there were other voices too, quieter maybe, and less likely to be carved into stone, but no less powerful. Some of the most persuasive, biting, and courageous political commentary during the American Revolution didn't come from powdered men in meeting halls. It came from women wielding pens like bayonets. They didn't just write about liberty, they questioned who got to claim it, One of the most remarkable was Mercy Otis Warren. A Massachusetts writer and thinker, she had no formal education, because women weren't allowed it, but her brothers were tutored alongside young John Adams, and she soaked up every word. Mercy married James Warren, a fellow patriot, but she didn't simply echo his opinions. She shaped them. In her parlor, patriot leaders gathered to discuss rebellion, and her sharp political mind turned those conversations into action. Mercy began writing anonymous political plays that satirized British officials and exposed loyalist corruption. One of her earliest works, The Agitator, mocked Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and called out British overreach. Her plays were published and circulated widely, and while no one dared to print her name, everyone knew who was behind the pen. She wasn't alone. Throughout the colonies, women were using their writing to frame the revolution not just as a war for independence from Britain, but as a larger struggle for justice, dignity, and moral accountability. Abigail Adams, in her famous letters to her husband John, didn't just offer updates from home. She challenged him. Remember the ladies. She wrote in 1776, warning that if women were left out of the new nation's laws, they too might rise up. It was more than a wife's plea. It was a demand for political thought to evolve, and while John responded with humor, her words left an impression on him and on history. Then there was Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved African girl brought to Boston as a child. She learned to read and write in a time when both were considered dangerous for someone like her. By the age of 20, she was publishing poetry that would stun both the colonies and Europe. Her verse praised Washington and the cause of liberty, while subtly pointing out the hypocrisy of a nation fighting for freedom while enslaving others. George Washington himself wrote to her, thanking her for her words and inviting her to visit him. She was the first African-American woman to publish a book, and her poetry quietly challenged the racial and moral contradictions of the Revolution. These women were not on the battlefield, but their words moved armies. They inspired loyalty, questioned power, and kept the revolutionary flame alive in the minds of people far from the front lines. And it wasn't just what they wrote, it was how they wrote it. They used satire, poetry, essays, and letters to spread ideas like fire through dry grass. Ideas that couldn't be confiscated, silenced, or burned. Ideas that traveled faster than soldiers and lasted longer than gunfire. They understood that revolutions aren't just fought with weapons. They are fought with stories, with questions, with bold thoughts passed hand to hand. And in that arena, they fought with unshakable clarity. They gave everything: homes, husbands, children, their own safety. And when the war ended, their names were barely whispered. The women of the American Revolution were praised when convenient, thanked when needed, and forgotten when the victory came. Their sacrifice was deep, and their loss often irreversible. And yet, when it came time to shape the new republic, they were left outside the room, looking in through the cracks of a promise they helped make, but were never invited to keep. The war touched every family. British soldiers quartered in homes, farms were burned, entire towns were pillaged. For women, the war was not a distant affair of soldiers in red coats and commanders on horseback. It was a daily intrusion. Take Esther Reed, who organized one of the first large-scale women's fundraising campaigns. She rallied the women of Philadelphia to collect funds for Continental soldiers, even convincing them to give up personal luxuries during a time of great scarcity. She helped raise over $300 in today's money, and proposed that the funds be used to provide the soldiers with shirts, sewn by the very women who raised the funds. It was a gesture of gratitude and purpose. But she died before she could see the end of the war, and her name rarely makes it into classrooms. Or think of women like Elizabeth Zane, who, during the 1782 siege of Fort Henry in what is now West Virginia, ran through a hail of bullets to retrieve gunpowder so the defenders could keep fighting. She didn't wear a uniform. She wasn't conscripted. She just ran, because no one else could or would. Her act saved lives, but she received no pension, no official recognition, no promise of anything beyond survival. For enslaved women, the stakes were even crueler. Many were promised freedom in exchange for helping the patriot cause, cooking for militias, nursing wounded soldiers, or even spying on loyalist households. Yet, once the war ended, their service was brushed aside, and many were returned to slavery. Their loyalty was used, but their humanity was never fully acknowledged by the new government that declared all men equal, without saying a word about the women who had labored under its flag. Wives of soldiers bore a burden few could understand. Many followed their husbands into the camps, enduring cold winters, disease, and starvation. Others stayed home, managing entire households alone while mourning loved ones they might never see again. Letters were lost, news came slowly, if at all. Some waited for years, only to discover that their husbands had died in unmarked fields far from home. They buried children, defended homes from raiding parties, and carried the trauma of war in silence. And still, when the war ended, they weren't considered citizens with rights. They were considered dependents, appendages to the very men they had kept alive. Even those who had spoken out, who had written essays, organized boycotts, led local relief efforts, were denied a voice in the political process, no right to vote, no legal say, no seat at the table. Their efforts were lauded in poetry and ignored in policy. They helped birth a nation, only to be told to go home and tend it, while others decided what freedom should mean. When the last cannon fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed, a new nation emerged, but not everyone who had fought for it shared equally in the celebration. The women of the American Revolution, who had carried water to soldiers, smuggled intelligence, raised families alone, sewn uniforms by candlelight, and written words that stirred rebellion, weren't invited into the halls of power. The ink was barely dry on the Constitution when it became clear that the same freedoms they had worked to secure would not be extended to them. Yet something had shifted, a spark had been lit. And though it would take generations, that spark would grow into a flame that would eventually challenge the very system those founding fathers had built. The revolution planted ideas about liberty, equality, voice, and agency, and women had not just witnessed it, they had lived it. They had tasted what it meant to act with purpose, to be heard in public meetings, to organize, to influence policy even from outside the chambers where laws were passed. They had done what no generation of women before them in the colonies had done, participated fully and unapologetically in shaping their world. And while the founders handed political power back and forth among themselves, women remembered that moment when the world cracked open and they had stepped through, if only briefly. One of the earliest signs of that legacy can be found in the letters and actions of Abigail Adams. Even before the war was won, she was writing to her husband, John Adams, urging him to remember the ladies as he helped draft new laws for the fledgling republic. She wasn't joking. She warned him that if women were left out of the new order, they might eventually rise up. It was a threat wrapped in affection, but it was real, and although her words were brushed aside in their time, they echoed across generations. In the decades that followed, women began to build on that revolutionary momentum. Education for girls expanded, slowly but significantly. Mothers, often those who had lived through the war, passed on the stories of what they had done and what they had lost. A growing belief took hold that women had a role to play in preserving the moral and civic fabric of the nation, a concept that would later be called Republican motherhood. It wasn't political power, but it was influence. And influence, as women had learned during the war, could move armies. By the early 1800s, women were gathering in small groups to discuss not just literature or domestic affairs, but reform, abolition, temperance, education, and eventually, suffrage. The seeds of rebellion planted during the Revolution began to sprout in places like Seneca Falls, where, in 1848, women convened the first Women's Rights Convention and declared, in language lifted directly from the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal. They were, in many ways, finishing a fight that had never truly ended. The women of 1776 may not have seen their names etched into the founding documents, but their fingerprints are everywhere, and the persistence, the resilience, the belief that liberty, once awakened, cannot be returned to sleep. They didn't just support the revolution. They left behind a legacy of quiet revolt that would rise again and again in new voices on new battlegrounds. The revolution promised freedom. The women who helped win it made sure we would never stop asking for whom and how soon.